Thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me here. Today I'm going to talk about two projects, as you just heard. Atlas of the Conflict and ZU, or the letter Z, just after Zionism. With both this project and with my work in general, I try to combine architecture or architecture analysis with activism, and I try to figure out and expose the mechanism and the processes behind the production of architecture and planning. These two projects, beyond their obvious narrative, which is the analysis of the territorial aspect of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, demonstrate an attempt to rethink the way we train to organize and label the spaces around us, and to investigate and challenge the position of the architect as a researcher, as a storyteller, and as a designer. I started working on the Atlas of the Conflict as an architecture student in Israel. I was born and raised in Israel, and I was made to believe that Palestine was an empty plot, empty land. One of the first sentences or notions that I remember from my childhood is, and later on it accompanied all my, let's say, upbringing, was this idea of the land without people for the people without land. So the history of the historical the Palestinian historical narrative was completely erased from our curriculum, from my curriculum. I didn't know. Later on, I decided that I want to study architecture, so I went to Italy to study architecture. And that was the first time that I realized, or I approached architecture from a historical point of view. The relation between architecture and spatial planning was always relating to a historical context. Actually, it was very struggling and constraining the fact that you cannot look to the future, but you are just being strangled by your own past. And I decided also, that's the reason that I also decided to leave Italy. And after 2 years, I moved to Israel. And I continue my architecture studies at the Technion. So Israel at the beginning felt very liberating, because you don't look back. You just negotiate your architecture product from the present condition. You start planning and designing from scratch, from a blank sheet. But I was, as an Italian architecture student, in my first assignment in the studio in the architecture faculty in Israel, I didn't look at the site from the present condition, but I went to the archives. It was mind-blowing to see the differences of this specific site from the way it looked in before the creation of Israel, before 1948. I found a series of aerial photos and surveys and maps made by the British mandate, and I rather quickly saw that the transformation of Israel since 1948 was not just a matter of growth or a creation of a new country, but there was something else there. There was another landscape that I wasn't completely aware of. So that's the newly built settlements by the Israeli architect. But there was another landscape that I wasn't completely aware of, at least not to its scale, and it was the destruction of the Arab-Palestine. This realization and the way changed the way I practice practice architecture. I stopped designing and I began researching the territorial transformation of Israel, and at the same time I have tried to collect as much as possible material and information on the way this transition and the formation of Israel affected the reality on the ground, or the eraser of Palestine. As an architecture student, I couldn't get away with doing research. I needed to visualize it. The most efficient format that I found at that time, and I still think that it's the most efficient format to visualize this research, was the map. It was obviously the best tool to expose not just the changes, but patterns and governmental policies. It deflated the notion of an incident that was used quite often in the context of explaining the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Some years later, I ended up with about 500 maps that showed the relation between Israel and Palestine. And I will show a bit more later. I remember as a child in Israel, one of the first things that you learn to draw was the map of the country. And a map is an expression of knowledge, of abstract analytical capacity. It also proves a territorial control. In Israel, the making of maps was a type of national obsession. The first pioneers came to the country and they start mapping. It seems that retroactively the act of documenting, I will say, our existence as Israeli had something to do with our emancipation as people, as a nation. It was also a statement: we are on the map and we are going to stay here. As such, Israel's maps quickly moved beyond a simple graphic representation. It became symbolic. We used map to prove our existence in Palestine, and we used atlases to tell the overall narrative, national narrative of our relation to the land. There are countless atlases made by historians, generals, geographers, archaeologists, and so on. It was clear to the, let's say, the Jewish pioneers that it wasn't, that if they want to create a Jewish state, they need to document their presence in Palestine. They mapped and photographed their existence. There are thousands of books and atlases on the evolution of, that shows and expose the evolution of the state of Israel from biblical time until today. None of them mention Palestine. So I decided that I would like to use the format of an atlas to document something else. I like the format of an atlas, and it's a challenging format because it's usually used as a standard document, national document that visualizes the assets of nations, territory, and its content, not just in Israel but also elsewhere. So the idea of using the atlas as a format was a challenge because I didn't have one nation that I wanted to show. I had two nations. So I decided to simply document Israel next to Palestine, and occasionally to document them on top of each other. The Atlas of the Conflict contains two parts, an atlas and a lexicon. The atlas part has 10 chapters. Each contains series of maps which appear one after the other, like time frames or snapshot that visualize the moments of territorial change. For instance, I will show a couple of chapters very quickly, and I'll explain how the book works. Patterns of settlements. From 1947 till 2010. The brown maps are Palestine, the blue maps are Israel. This is a map from 1947, before the establishment of the state, where you see the spread of Palestinian villages and cities and the distribution of Israeli localities to the right. After the Israel War of Independence in 1948, more than 500 Palestinian villages and cities were destroyed and erased, bulldozed to the ground. About 1 million people became refugees overnight. Most of them settled in the area of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but some of them spread in the Middle East. Those are the oldest refugee camps in the world, made by the UN, and are existing until this day. It was shocking to see the differences between 1947 and 1950. This is after the establishment of Israel, the distribution of settlements. So this is why the map was the most efficient tool to show patterns. Another thing that happened during this process is that inside of Israel, about 100,000 people remain as internal refugees, internally displaced persons, and they are living in unrecognized villages. These villages are not appearing on maps, on national maps, official maps, and it means that the inhabitants of these villages has no address, and therefore they cannot have access to state services like water, electricity, well, it's America, but medical care, education, which is common in Israel. It's subsidized by the state. So this is also a phenomenon that I was focusing on in another project, and soon there is going to be another book about the unrecognized villages. But yeah, so I move on. 1970, after the 67 war, after the 6 Days War, Israel occupied you see here the small map, the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, together with this. By then, the number increased, together with all most of the refugees from 1948 that were settled in the refugee camps in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. The first thing that Israel did when they occupied the land is to start master planning settlements and civic occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and you start seeing already the first settlement. This is a map from the 70s, or showing the situation in the 70s. That's the 80s, and you see how the settlements increased. This is a map from 1990s. What you see here is after the peace agreement with Egypt, Israel withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula, and the settlements here disappeared. That's a map from 2000. Again, you see how the settlements are increasing, and it seems like there is a seamless relation almost between the State of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories from 1967. And those are the two maps on top of each other, and when you see this reality on top of each other, you cannot imagine how someone can draw a border which defines Israel and Palestine on this land. The next thing that I would like to talk about is quickly. If you have questions, if I'm going too fast, or please let me know. but otherwise I will just continue. Borders and border dynamics. Sorry. There is a strict relation between occupation of land and the act of inhabitation, as it was visible in the series of maps that I just showed. A long time in Israel, the notion of sovereignty derives from the physical presence of people. People occupy and guard the land. We call it in Israel a living wall or a living border. So what defines sovereignty is not the border, is not the line, but it's the presence of people. And actually, since the establishment of Israel until today, Israel has no official border or agreed upon border. And everything that defines where Israel is the presence of settlements. In addition to the relation between settlements and border, there is a greater narrative. Most of the Israeli atlases describe seamlessly the historical Jewish presence in Palestine until this day. The greater national narrative and the distortion of context, territory, and time create a make-believe as if there is a historical continuity of the existence of Israel since biblical time until today. If you look at when you look at all these historical atlases, I will show now how the borders transform and shift. This is the borders of Israel, of Jewish presence in Palestine. And this is 1948, the first plan made by the UN for the partition plan of Israel and Palestine. This is after 1948 war, and this is how it's shifting a long time until today, since 1948 until now. What is happening after, I don't know, you probably heard about it. After the Oslo Agreement and the negotiation process with the Palestinian Authority, the borders start changing, they become internal borders. They start with the negotiation process, a new type of sovereignty and control appeared. They call it Area A, B, and C. And these internal borders basically create enclaves of densely populated Palestinian settlement, Palestinian existence. Sorry, this is how it. These are all the borders together. In that context, I would like to show one more thing with the internal borders. I would like to enter to another chapter, the wall. The Palestinian occupied territories since 1967 are surrounded by a variety of territorial control mechanisms that fragments the territory into enclaves and introduces a sophisticated system of national sovereignty. This is another chapter in the book that show the situation in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and again it's showing the Palestinian presence in relation to the Israeli presence in these areas. It goes from here. You can see these are all the layers together, and to the right there is a map of the Green Line, the international recognized border, and the wall that is being built by the State of Israel, and most of it is already got built. In these maps, you see the Palestinian enclaves in relation to the military and civilian occupation of the West Bank. All these tiny icon symbols are checkpoints, block road, all kinds of military intervention to prevent Palestinian movement and to close the Palestinian enclaves. In this year, you have you can see the Palestinian movements, and there all these road gates, roadblocks, earth mount checkpoints, different type of checkpoints, and observation towers, etc., are relating to the Palestinian movement, while the Israeli movement in the West Bank is running smoothly with the highways that are for Israelis only. Another part that is documented in the wall chapter is the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is a complete, it's hermetically closed by now. It has a wall that surrounds it on the land side, and the restriction and the border and sea border in the seafront, the restrictions are are shrinking, are increasing over time. And if in the beginning of the negotiation process with the Palestinian authority, Israel allowed 20-mile distance from the shore to allow the Palestinian to use 20-mile distance from the shore. Now it allows it 3 miles. So it's a complete closed enclave. Let's see. The next thing that I used in the atlas, I had a feeling at a certain moment that the maps that I produced are very abstract and clinical. And I missed the stories, the regulations, I missed anecdote, I missed the messiness that can come with that comes with reality, with life. So I added a lexicon to the book. I like working with lexicon because it expanded the definition and the space in which you can you are working, or at least I could work and show the process of making the book, but also the things that I found relevant to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So in a way, it's a subjective lexicon, but it helped me to make more vivid the context or the depicted reality that you see in the map. And the lexicon is not scientific, and it has multiple taxonomies according to alphabetic order, time, personas, and negotiation process. Those are a snapshot of the lexicon. It was very difficult for me to stick to one format. Almost like in the title itself, the conflict can be found in many ways in that book. While in one hand I've tried to work along strict system of time, color, position, narrative, I constantly try to dismantle these systems and introduce other ways to go through the information or to represent it. While doing that, I try to open up numerous amount of narratives and almost lose control over the structure of the book. It was a challenge because the book is a physical object, and it's a linear object. It contains number of pages, and we are all trying to follow the numbers and go from 1 to 2. And I try to introduce a new system that will let you dismantle this linear order. And in the bottom of the page, of each page, there are different numbers, if you can see here. that if you follow them, if you follow this is the linear order, and if you follow these links, it gets you somewhere else, and it starts opening a different type of stories. So if you look at this page, let's say page number 77, and you read the book from here, then the Gaza Strip, you see a difference. You discover a different narrative of the Gaza Strip than the one that the obvious one or the linear one. It can take you to the lexicon, to the page of that tell the story of the Turkish flotilla that tried to break the siege on the Gaza Strip, or it can take you to a more detailed text that explain what is in the Gaza Strip, the refugee camps, etc. It can take you to a page that describes the Gaza Strip barriers, which are which in much more detailed way, in a different way, and it also shows stories of. It shows how the borders look like, but also it shows a story of a snapshot, or this to the. Here it shows a snapshot from a news item showing how after the Hamas came into power, they broke down the wall that connect the Gaza Strip and Egypt, and let the people free the people to go and buy to move out of the strip, buy groceries, try to give them some hope to lead a normal life. But if you continue on this and run on this link, you can go to different other pages, and you can get here to the tunnels. There are 1,500 tunnels under the Gaza Strip. Some people call it Gaza subway, but as the strip is completely under siege, there is still a movement of there is still illegal transaction or illegal attempts to break the siege by the Gazans. Israel call it, that's the IDF version of the tunnels, and they describe it as smuggling of arms. And if you continue, sorry, you can get here, and this is again a news item on the Gaza Strip, where the Gazan diggers are explaining how they how they can smuggle everything through the tunnel, from cigarettes to lions, but I'll get to that later. So the tunnels are also linked to other tunnels, and those are the Israeli tunnels that are built in the West Bank. Here you see the bypass road that going through Palestinian cities and Palestinian land and connecting the settlements with each other and with Jerusalem. And here there is another, this is an archaeological dig under Temple Mount that lead to tunnels that expose the old city of David. Well, there are a lot of different stories that can open up. So here in the small, I don't think you see it here well, but yeah, there is, this is a, here it is. This is a photo of in Hood, one of the unrecognized Palestinian villages under once a project, and one of the things, in order to do a project on site, we needed to create a space for ourselves as outsiders because the only structures that are there are homes. So we built the Golden Heart Pavilion, which was the first community building in the village. You don't really see it, but it was inspired. It had double golden domes that were inspired by the Temple Mount. So there are a lot of different stories and anecdotes that can be revealed. The story of the Gaza Strip, or the waterfront of the Gaza Strip, can also take you here to the negotiation table between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. After finishing the book, I've been asked to make an exhibition about it, and I've decided. Well, I just finished the book, and it was hard work. It was about 10 years of mapping, and not exclusively, but still, I didn't want, and I adjusted all the information to one format, which is a book, and when I've been asked to do an exhibition, I needed to rethink about the format. I needed to rethink about how to show the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in completely different context. So I flipped through the book. I knew that I didn't want to blow up maps and put them on the wall. I wanted to use all the elements that come with making an exhibition. I wanted to create a spectacle and to have a different physical presence of the physical presence in space, etc. So after I took the book and I started thinking to myself, okay, so where is the story? And not where is the story, or which story I would like to tell. And I got stuck in the last page of the book. Zur, the letter Z, the letter Z of the lexicon. I'm sorry, it's 1 a.m. in my head at this moment. So, so I got stuck at that page, Zionism and Zoo. And I'll just explain a little bit about these two terms. Zionism is the national ideology that led that called for the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people, not necessarily in Palestine, but it emerged in the 19th century. It was part of the Spring of Nation, and Zoo is describe a story of a private zoo in the Gaza Strip, owned by a family, it's very complex thing to maintain a zoo under occupation, under siege, and there are different type of challenges when you do that. Basically, the idea of this zoo was to create a place of leisure, a place where the Palestinian people could come and could go and come across exotic animals that arrive from far away. It maybe makes you fancy about other life. I didn't really enter to the psychology aspect of what it means to have a zoo under siege, but I found it fascinating. But there is one thing that struck me about this zoo is most of the animals, the exotic animals, got smuggled through the tunnels from Africa. So they managed to smuggle lions and some other monkeys and etc. But again, maintaining zoo under siege is complex the owner of the zoo needs to deal not just with maintaining the animals, but also with its own captivity, and the animals become subjected to poverty and occupation themselves, because if there is restriction in providing certain type of medicine, then you cannot really take care of the animals. Another thing that was happening in that zoo is that, there are about 7 zoos in the Gaza Strip, this is one of them, is that the exotic animals are dying constantly because the vets know how to deal with domesticated animals, but they don't know how to treat exotic animals, so they overdose them and they die. And again, so it is a big challenge to maintain a zoo in the Gaza Strip, and in order to survive, the owner of the zoo needed to be creative, and they were creative. At a certain moment, when they ran out of animals, they decided to take donkeys and transform them into zebras using hair color. I thought that this action of taking domesticated animal, transforming it into a wild animal, and then captivating it in a cage, mind-blowing. And I decided to make a project about this page, about the letter Z, about zoo and Zionism. And as much as I was thinking about it, it was more and more fascinating, this incidental connection between these two terms, the combination of Zionism and zoo. It pulled me into a new research on classification and taxonomy, and I started looking back, or trace back, the origin, it actually took me to a place where it all began. And the atlas was a process of tracing back and documenting the process, documenting the evolution of this territorial transformation. But suddenly I was in the 19th century, and there I start looking at classification, and classification gone wrong. So Zionism emerged at the time of the Spring of Nation. At that time, Europe changed and refigured itself. Borders shifted, nations become more pure, and the nation, and for instance, I could say French for the French people, France for the French, Germany for the Germans, Poland for the Poles. And then the Jews felt a bit neglected, and they, in the emerging new spirit of the emancipation of nation and the new men, as a local minority, they weren't really emancipated, and they weren't considered part of the new German or the new Pole or the new French. And of course, there were a lot of other pogroms and wars, and consequently, they came up with Zionism and classified themselves as the new Jews. They called for the emancipation of the Jewish people and their settlement in a designated homeland. Eventually, they found themselves in Palestine, and the process of transformation of that land began, as I showed in the previous slides. But yeah, back to the age of, to the time of enlightenment or of reason. It was a time of classification, not just of nation. Not just nation got classified, but the whole world around us, man, race, animal, insects, plants, everything got grouped and got labeled. For me, the exhibition, starting from an outcome, or the letter Z, Zionism, and zoo, become a project about classification gone wrong. I decided to continue the line of tracing back and exploring simultaneously the classification of nations and of animals while focusing on the evolution of the urban zoo, focusing on the typology of the cage, classification of nation, and focusing on an outcome which is the non-classified, the Gaza Strip. There are a few interesting moments in the development of the zoo. The first period is the Age of Reason, the 18th, 19th century. The urban zoo was part of the emerging public sphere in Europe, like the parks, the cafes, the bars, the library, the academia. At that time, the cages were very small and the spaces for the visitors was wide. And diverse. It looked like, you can see it here, it looked like these large parks. At that time, animals got classified and in cages that called, this is a sketch from, the first sketch for the London Zoo, the house of cats, the house of birds, and so on. After the World War and during the 50s and the 60s, zoos were housed in a more modernistic environment. Their cages were slightly bigger. The relation between animals and human in the age of car became more and more abstract, and they were a natural part of modern life. Animals were treated like beautiful objects, and zoos looked like art galleries. Additionally, with the development of science into more reactionary approach and the invention of vaccine, the cages were kept sterile and the animals very clean. The last typology of zoo that I looked at was zoo as a research and educational facility. After the World Wars and raising awareness toward human rights and psychology, scientists started investigating the emotional development, not just of humans but also of animals. It became evident that animals suffer in captivity, and a new movement that promoted the liberation of animals in captivity started coming, and promote the animal rights. And another thing is that the zoos changed. The spaces that designated to the animal were much bigger, and you can see here in the diagram. And the one that was given to the visitor got much smaller. The spectacle element was limited, and the cage mimicked the wild, the natural habitat of the animal in display. These are a series of animals showing the transformation of the cage a long time. And in section. So this is zoo as a jail, zoo as an art gallery, and zoo as an educational facility. Okay, back to Gaza. That's the parallel analysis that I've made. There are again about 7 zoos in the Gaza Strip, and Maryland, the one with the zombie, is one of them. Their stories are tragic. Most of the wild animals are again smuggled through tunnels in metal boxes. When they arrive to the strip, they are maintained in tiny cages, subjected to the consequences of poverty, war, Israeli occupation, and permits and restriction of transfer of goods. Maryland is located in Gaza City. It became again famous with the zombie. Here you see slides of the cages that I found in news items about the zoos in Gaza. That's Maryland. Sorry. Typologically, the Gaza Zoo can be classified under the zoo as jail. The early zoo typology from the age of reason, very small cages and short life expectancy of the animals. This is the act of painting the donkey. For the exhibition, we also did a kind of a survey of animal, which are domesticated animal, wild animals, and how many are in a cage, the size of the animal in relation to the cage, and most of them died. The donkey were, by the way, one of them died during the last war, and one of them got sold. And he's back to be a donkey. I always found the Gaza Strip as the most extreme outcome of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are about 1.5 million inhabitants in the Strip. 1 million of them are refugees from 1948 and are still living in refugee camps. This project allowed me to study the Strip, and I actually used a lot of work of a researcher from Harvard called Sarah Roy. She also contributed an essay for the zoo reader that is standing there. So the Gaza Strip is 139 square miles with almost 1.7 inhabitants, if you want to be more precise. The land is closed by walls and the sea by rigorous restrictions. The seafront borders are constantly shrinking, as I said before, from 20 miles in 1994 to 3 miles today. In the bottom left, a small image here of an experiment called Behavioral Sync, conducted in Maryland in the 1960s, was aimed to examine the effect of overcrowding in a world that's supposed to be perfect. The experiment was done on rats. The researcher inserted a few couple of rats in a perfect cage. We call it a perfect wall. The rats were given water, food, and nesting material as much as they needed. The amount of food, water, and nesting material increased with the reproduction. The only thing that wasn't changing is the size of the cage. After a certain amount of growth, the researcher, that was called Callum, noticed that the behavior of the rats changed. They became hyper-violent. They showed signs of neglect and cannibalism. The experiment was later on led to theories on urban density. To the right is the diagram showing the density in the Gaza Strip, and here is a diagram showing the average density in the world, the average density in Israel. I showed this project in the Netherlands, so average density in the Netherlands, and that's the density in the Gaza Strip. Additionally to this research on density, I looked at the crossing at the checkpoints. It's all the Gaza crossing. Here is an image of transfer of goods from one side of the wall to the other. And what you see is that except of the smuggling, everything else that entered and exited the Strip depends on Israel and is bound to permit of usually governmental official and military generals. The food supply is limited and restricted. There are months, for instance, that chocolate and sugar are not allowed. and it depends on a decision of the general in charge. We made a series of infographic for the exhibition showing month by month what is allowed and what is not allowed in the Strip. During wartime, the supply stops. The closure of the Gaza Strip is not hermetic. Oh, these are just typological sections that we produced of the Gaza Strip. So the closure on the Gaza Strip is not hermetic. Under the strip, there are, again, I repeat, 1,500 tunnels. In Sarah Roy's book, called Hamas and the Civic Society in Gaza, she described how smuggling became the main source of income for the Hamas and the way it weakens the traditional formal business. The black market makes regulation, governance, and transparency impossible and maintain the existing status quo of siege. And it also explains why Israel tolerated it. In fact, there is no doubt that Israel tolerated the tunnel. The best tunnel digger in the Strip is a rich man, and he's so rich that he made he's driving a gold-plated Hummer. So I think it's not difficult to recognize him, and. And there are a lot of other stories that we collected along this research. On tunnels, for instance, the tuk-tuk story, hundreds of tuk-tuks were smuggled through the tunnels, coming from China to Egypt and from Egypt to the Strip, and they replaced the donkey, but under severe siege when there is no fuel, then the donkey remained the most dependable source of transport in the Strip. Yeah, and so on. Zor, or the letter Z, just after Zionism became a project of classification gone wrong. Sorry, I'm really sleeping. Part of my brain is sleeping at this moment. Like in the atlas, it positioned different themes next to each other. These themes, even though running parallel, they form a sort of intervention. They challenge the notion of order and space in the way we are using it. Like in the atlas, in the zoo, I've decided to add a lexicon, a single narrative. Never makes sense. It was important to me to allow different narratives to run next to each other and to open to interpretation to open it up to the interpretation of the reader. The lexicon and the archive are interesting format as they allow multiplicity incidents to appear. And yeah. So those are images partly images of the lexicon. It's not a lexicon, it's kind of a lexicon index, and it's also part of the reader. It's added to the reader. Let's go through it. Again, here I used the colors and a way to distinguish what is what. So the blue is the zoo and the brown is the Gaza Strip. The black is everything that is in between. The gray zone is the Marl and the zoo in the Gaza Strip. Yeah. Another thing that I've done for the exhibition, I experiment with infographics, classification, illustration of either animal, insect, or plant during the it seems to be like a classic or a graphic representation that combine different type of information systems, such as detailed drawing and a series of information indicators like links and sources of information that take you to a book or explain you a certain type of organ. The drawing technique of the illustration was changing according to the illustrator. It wasn't set yet. The first classification drawing, and they didn't have a standard. So you could find all kinds of different stories running in the background. They could be religious, like a small village with a big church, or it could be moralistic, like a hardworking farmer chasing a bull. But these drawings were beautiful, and they, in a way, reminded me the maps. And it was a challenge to use a different type of infographic to tell a story, and also within this kind of diagram or visuals, there are links that leads to an archive, and in this archive there are stories. I used 3 domesticated animals, a donkey, a pigeon, and a rat that are running through the exhibition. It's part of the narrative of the exhibition. I'll show images later. And these animals are transformed. In the background, there are illustrations of news items about the Gaza Strip. Another series of embroidery. I forgot that. We also we try to use a different technique when we did this infographic. So we used embroidery instead of technical drawing. So we also domesticated the representation techniques. The second series of embroidery, I had a conversation with an artist friend of mine, and he told me that there is a Dutch NGO that adopted a village in Zimbabwe and trained the women in that village how to embroider. And I got in touch with them, and I told them, can I send you drawings? And this drawing maybe could be embroidered by the local village. I thought it's interesting to see how, if I can send a technical drawing to the wild. I was curious what will come back. And another thing that I was interested in is if I'm sending something exotic, something to the natural habitat, images of animals to the natural habitat, maybe they will get character. So I received the cloth back, the material that I sent. I received it back with this letter. Here with the 3 cloths, which have taken a little longer than normal because the women are very busy in the field at the moment. Most of the work has been done while sitting under a tree guarding the crops from baboons. So, and this is the embroidery that I received back. And they're super precise. I almost done. And I just show the images of the exhibition itself. This is a mental map of the exhibition. The exhibition was about classification gone wrong. It's a cage transformed into a house and falls apart. A cage. The format of this profile is a standard size of a refugee shelter. And it has a lot of stories in it. It's and part of the research material was here. There was a window wall, and we just used it as stickers on the wall, and they accompanied the walk through the exhibition. And we had an archive and a desert, and you could pick up material from the archive and that you found interesting here, and just sit and read the material. So it's an attempt to transform the research into a different format, into an exhibition, into space. And those are images from, this is an image from a Gaza Strip, from the Gaza Strip after bombardment. This is an image of the exhibition. We had live animals in the exhibition. The project was completely not politically correct, but we talked about Gaza, so it can be not politically correct. And those are images of the exhibition. We had a living room, and it has all kinds of elements like magic. When the donkey stick his head out, he looked like a deer. And we had a television with news from Gaza, and density diagram on the wall. Also cages, red cages. The cages, it's funny to suddenly talk like an architecture designer. So the outside part was hard cage metal, and the inside part of the house of the cage I've done with a fashion designer, and she made this macrame structure. So everything was also, there was another narrative that was running through the exhibition, the relation between the exotic and the wild, and the domestication, the domesticated aspect of it. So there are a lot of techniques that were borrowed, like the embroidery and the macrame from the household. And it's images. Once the donkey escaped, it's not Photoshop, it's real. But it was the exhibition was in Maastricht. It's on the border with Belgium, and we discovered that in Belgium they really like donkeys, and they have donkeys as pets. So they were very sweet, these donkeys, and they were used to be in a closed environment. That's almost the last story. Okay, so the reader is on the table there. It contains few essays. It's explained the narrative, the main narrative. It has an essay about captivity by David Hancock. David Hancock is an Australian zoologist, and he made an amazing book in the 70s about architecture and animals. This book was very helpful, so I decided that I want to find David, and I found him in Australia, and I told him about the story, and he was fascinated and wrote an essay. I've asked Sarah Roy to write an essay, and she's a world expert on the Gaza Strip, and I asked Ido Amin, is the cartoonist of Haaretz newspaper, or used to be the cartoonist of Haaretz newspaper, to write an essay about exotics. So I think it's fun essays, and there are some other stories, diagrams, maps in that reader. Okay, that's the last one. Mahmoud Baragut is the boy that painted the donkey together with his brother and his sister. I Skyped with him today, and he told me that he got accepted to communication engineering studies in Germany. I actually traced him, and found him on Facebook, and I invited him to come to the exhibition, to the opening of the exhibition, and he agreed. So this is Mahmoud in the exhibition space, and since then we are in touch. So he managed to smuggle himself out, and he's now studying, as I said, in Germany, so it was possible for him to come to the opening of the exhibition. We also hang out. When he came to Maastricht, we also went up north, and we went to check out the Artis Zoo in Amsterdam, one of the oldest zoos in Europe, and the zebras were very happy to see him, so they constantly came to him, and it was exciting. I think that's it. So, we should end with
Hey, I'm Untitled Chapter. I work with CLAB, I'm a researcher with CLAB here, which works with Studio-X. I thought it might be necessary to keep the conversation rolling after this, but we have such a full house that I think it's great to just kind of turn it out for a few questions. So maybe if we take like 3 questions, and then if there are other questions, we can ask them informally over some wine.
Thank you. I'm amazed by your work. Can you talk about how different narratives are using maps to convey contradictory messages, and how to make it very unnuanced? For Israelis are using the map to show how Israel is shrinking, showing with Sinai, Gaza, South Lebanon, etc., and how the pro-Palestinians are using maps to show the same. Can you explain those dynamics of using maps?
Well, maps are subjective, and I think the most interesting example, or the most obvious example, is the unrecognized villages, because they are not on the map. They are still not on the formal maps. If you buy a map of Israel, you don't see the Palestinian map. These villages, they are absent. Other elements that are absent in Israeli national maps are, for instance, the Green Line. It's not existing, so you don't. It seems like it's one country. Israel always used map in a very selective manner. Its interest was to document one thing, which is the existence of Israel, and that became, at a certain moment, it was affirmed by the international community, and that's what made eventually the international community to recognize Israel. And what you see now that is happening in the Palestinian side, they realized after a long, long time that it's time to start documenting their existence. And there are no atlases of Palestine, of course, or not of course, but I think the last atlas of Palestine was done in the 50s and documented the destruction of Palestine, the atlas of Salman Abu Sita. But now they start using NGOs and civic societies helping the Palestinian community to document their struggle in the occupied territory, so you see more and more maps happening. Google Earth is still very blurry in Israel, so you cannot use Google to help you, or aerial photography to help you doing the maps. So most of it is done by, I call it groundwork. So and you see that the effect of these maps, I mean the B'Tselem map, Eyal Weizmann work, etc., it has quite a big impact. Yeah, did I answer a question?
I was living in Cape Town, and someone came to South Africa and talking about that one image you had of the overlapping maps of Israel and Palestine, and how interwoven they are at this point now. And she was describing the South African experience as far as the black movement against colonization, and the process at the beginning when the Europeans first arrived. The slogans of the movement were to remove the Europeans entirely from South Africa, and actually she was saying that this interweaving of the map forced the South Africans to change the slogan towards democracy and towards saying we want to be included within one democratic state. So from the Palestinian perspective, this interweaving, I can understand it as hopefully shifting towards wanting to survive in one space. But I'm wondering from the other perspective, the logic of this constant increase that you're saying, do you see the logic as about actually just genocide, total annihilation, or is it about, at some level, about a certain willingness to coexist?
I try to be optimistic. But, well, I do think that it's very difficult. I mean, there are facts on the ground. There are two nations. There are about, let's say, 13, 14 million people living in this area, and you cannot really draw. I don't know how you can draw a line. I have no idea. I made these maps, but I don't know how to draw a line that separates these two populations. So I cannot imagine any other scenario than a one-state solution in which all the inhabitants enjoy equality. Yeah. So that's for me, and there are a lot of similarities between South Africa and Israel, both in the creation of maps, because these unrecognized entities are also known from South Africa, that a certain part of the landscape wasn't documented in official map, but they were still there. And you have destruction, like District 6 and other places that can be similar to what have happened during the Nakba in Israel. So, there are a lot of similarities and a lot of learn. And actually, South Africa is it keeps me in a way optimistic. Like there is possibility for a one-state solution.
It seems to me that cartography and lexicography are not the future of architectural activism because they're so subjective, and that the reality on the ground is so different. And then you see things happening like what happened in E1 recently with Bal Shams, with the tent protests, which seem a lot more to the point and a lot more provocative. And I'm wondering what you feel about the future of architectural activism and movements like that tent protest, and how people that are not situated in or around E1 can take part in those kind of movements.
Well, I think I'm not for one thing or another. I think everything can be important, and eventually these maps are important because they weren't there before. So they show a certain type of patterns, and a map is a tool. Even though that it's subjective, I agree with what you said, it's subjective, but still it was the only way to show certain type of patterns. So it used in order to achieve a certain goal or aim, which is to show patterns of change. And I needed the national scale to show it. What is happening with Bab el-Shams is exciting. I think it's super interesting. The Palestinian settlement movement, this is what you mean? Of course, I mean, you can take a map and start documenting it, but of course the movement on the ground has a lot of impact, and without the movement on the ground, I couldn't have made the maps of Palestine, because again, there is no Google Earth, and you needed, or it's not valid there. So I needed to work with people who does surveys on the ground with activists, etc., to find, to place dots on the map. So I think it's complementary. And the future of activism, I think it's just about diversity and constantly trying to define redefine and define what you do in order to achieve a certain thing, and keep your mind open.
Thank you very much. I think we probably have more questions, but we can all stand up, grab another drink. Hopefully Malkin can stick around and answer those questions, buy a book, and thank you very much, Malkin.